Our final speaker of the evening is Dr. Brad Sickler. Dr. Brad Sickler, assistant professor of philosophy, majored in physics as an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, where he did research on superconductance and geophysics. After finishing his degree, he felt called to ministry and began doing graduate work in biblical and theological studies. Eventually, this passion led Dr. Sickler to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where he earned a master's in Christian thought, writing his thesis on whether the universe requires a cause. His interest in the intersection of science, theology, and philosophy continued to grow during his doctoral studies at Purdue University, where he completed a PhD in philosophy. His fascination with causation and laws of nature resulted in a dissertation on Immanuel Kant's defense of the principle of causation, that every event has a cause. Most recently, Dr. Sickler's interest in science and theology has led him to the Center for Scholarship and Christianity at Oxford University, where he spent the past 2 summers participating in a seminar entitled Bridging the Two Cultures of Science and the Humanities. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Sickler is an ordained minister and a former pastor who loves spending time with his amazing wife, Alicia, and his 2 wonderful children, Abby and Ben. Let's extend a warm welcome to Dr. Brad Sickler.
Well, I realize a lot of you are probably here by mistake, thinking that you were at Mary Poppins. But being good, polite Minnesotans, you didn't want to get up and leave in the middle, and so I thought, maybe Dr. Heyer's sort of like our participation in the creation of things is kind of like drawing the lamp out of the satchel, right, when Mary Poppins... And Dr. Morks is obviously a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Yeah, so it's just as good. My theme song will be, stay awake, don't rest your head. Well, I'm going to talk about natural theology and laws of nature. And there's a problem with what I see in the use of probability in some of these arguments for God's existence. So I want to look at that and then suggest that there might be another way to think about what the laws of nature tell us about God's existence just through a different vehicle, not through this route of probabilistic calculation. So a quotation I'm putting up here, if you can't read this, I'm going to read it for you. It's from a philosopher named John Foster. And he says, "We cannot envisage a satisfactory causal explanation of the basic regularities in natural terms. We are looking for a way of explaining the regularities in terms of some concrete cause or causes that lie outside the natural realm." So this is the culmination of a book that he's written where his conclusion is, we won't find it there. He says, "As far as I can see, there's only one approach now that's available. This would be to suppose that what causes the regularities is a source of agency of a personal kind. So the question, why are things thus regular? The answer in each case would be because this being or these beings have deliberately made them so." So this line of argument is actually the one that I want to look a little more closely at. So I've got a couple of versions of laws of nature. So there's a lot of discussion about what a law of nature actually is. It takes place in the science world, it takes place in the philosophy world, even in the world of theology. And broadly speaking, there are 2 camps about this. One is necessitarianism and one is the regularist view. So a necessitarian about laws of nature will say that a law of nature is or describes something in the very nature of the world, based on a thing's essential properties, and there are different varieties of this. But the idea here is something like electrons repel each other because that is in the nature of negative charges. That's what it is to be a negative charge. The rival version of laws of nature says a law of nature is nothing other than a statement or a description of regularities. And as observers, this is what we're limited to, right? We don't see these productive causes, or what David Hume would call hidden springs and connections. So the regularist account says there isn't any necessity, at least none that we could know of. There is just a regular succession. And when you see this enough times, you start to form a feeling of anticipation and so forth. So when I'm thinking about this, do laws of nature require God? I can say, well, we've got basically two ways of thinking about what laws are, the necessitarian view and the regularist view. Well, let's suppose the necessitarian view is right. According to this, if things behaved differently, they would be different things. And this seems very plausible, right? I mean, if you could hit a baseball with a banana, you'd start to wonder, is that really a banana? It seems like there's something very unusual here about this banana. It's acting like a bat, not a banana. So things behave the way they do because of the kinds of things they are. For example, Coulomb's law. Coulomb's law is sort of like the law of gravity, but for charges. And it relates how charges pull on each other or push each other. And Coulomb's law is responsible, for example, for giving water its dipole moment. So there's a 105-degree bend in a water molecule. It's not a straight line. And because of this, there's an area of the molecule that's slightly positive and an area that's slightly negative. Without that, it wouldn't be water. It would be something else. Schwatter, maybe. Coulomb's law, though, also determines that the weak bonding between sodium and chlorine will lead to the salt, which is salt, right, table salt, made from halite or evaporated out of water. It's going to show that, or it's going to determine that the salt breaks apart in the water, right? The bonds between the sodium and the chlorine are weak. They can be pulled apart by the water. That's why when you put salt in water, it dissolves. So water and salt, however, could not exist if it weren't for Coulomb's law. Coulomb's law is a necessary condition for water and salt being water and salt. It's also the thing that makes it the case that water will dissolve the salt. So given salt and water, solubility is necessary. So here we have a kind of necessitarian account of a law of nature, the law being salt dissolves in water. Not very exotic. We make use of this all the time. But if you think about it in terms of necessity, that's how it would operate. On the other hand, we can think of maybe a regularist view of laws. According to regularism, the regularity view, a law is just a description of patterns, and that's it. It doesn't say anything about why those patterns occur. It doesn't make any judgments about whether they must have occurred, whether there are possible worlds where they're different. It just says, this is a pattern. We see it over and over. Therefore, it's a law. This is also a popular view among empiricists. So there are numerous methods for describing scattered data points, though. I've got a couple of graphs up here. And it may be hard to see if you're in the back, but if you look on the one on the right, you'll see a sort of horseshoe bend. And if you look at the one on the left, you'll see squiggles, is the technical mathematical term for that pattern. But both of these are going through the same data points. So when it comes to a scattered set of data points, it's always possible to create maybe infinitely many functions that will go through those data points. So if we look at both of these approaches, the necessitarian view and the regularist view, what we start to see is laws of some sort are going to be inevitable. Because either things have natures, and it's their natures, or what it is to have a nature is to be disposed to act in certain ways, or things are what they are just because of the regularities they have, and what we mean by a law of nature is just a description of regularities. Well, you will always be able to impose some sort of pattern on any set of events, so regularity is actually pretty cheap, right? If that's all it means to be a law of nature, you can create a regularity for any set of objects or of behaviors. So you take a red stop sign, a red apple, and a red notebook, and you say, well, they have something in common. They're all red, right? And you can find things that will connect any set of objects together. So if we have a necessitarian view of laws, laws are going to be inevitable because that's just what it is to be a kind of thing. If you have a regularist view of laws, laws are inevitable because any set of data points can be mapped with some sort of function or other. So it seems to me that this argument that only God can account for laws is not going to be very effective. But maybe we're not capturing the real spirit of the argument here. Maybe what we are looking for really is not just that there are laws, but really something more like this: that there is a relatively small number of fairly simple laws, that there's a kind of elegance to the world, that the world is the kind of place that we can make predictions about. Right? If I eat bread and sometimes it nourishes me and sometimes it kills me, or I don't know whether to eat something or not to eat it. I mean, we need these kinds of regularities to make our way through the world. So maybe the idea is the fact that there is a fairly small number of relatively simple laws that allow us to navigate things. Maybe that's what we're really after. So it's not so much just that there are laws, but there are a few laws that are fairly elegant. And this is expressed by another philosopher, a guy named Robin Collins. He says, now it seems that the vast majority of possible universes will have a highly chaotic configuration of mass energy compared to our own universe. Things might have been very, very messy. If this is right, then a universe like ours with a configuration of mass energy that's describable by simple fundamental laws is bound to be rare. A generic observer should not expect to find itself in a universe that is orderly throughout. We would not expect the arrangement of mass energy to be describable by a set of simple underlying laws. Yet, as we know from quantum mechanics and general relativity, the underlying laws of nature are highly simple and elegant. Now, such beauty, elegance, and ingenuity make sense if the universe was designed by God. Given that theism naturally explains these features of the laws of nature, however, the atheist must admit that theism offers a better explanation of them than atheism, and thus that they support theism over atheism. Now, I've got other quotations I could put up here, but this idea is actually fairly common in natural theology, which is arguing for the existence of God based on our observations of nature. So why would I have a problem with this one? Well, if you consider this notion, what we're saying is it's improbable, given all the ways that the universe might have turned out, or maybe given the infinitely many universes that are actually out there, if you like the multiverse model, maybe what we are saying, or what it appears that we're saying is, it's improbable to end up with a nifty universe like this one. It's much more probable that we would have ended up with a mess, right? A dog's dinner of a universe. Okay. And that's the part I really want to think about, that probability attribution here. So let's consider something. So we can talk about probability distribution functions, and these are just functions that describe probability distributions. That's why they have a good name, right? Probability distribution function, a function that describes probability distributions. Suppose that the number of basic laws or entities is completely random, like rolling dice or drawing cards. So you're at the drawing board, right? And you're going to set the initial conditions up for your universe. How many fundamental entities are there going to be? Maybe 3, maybe just protons, neutrons, and electrons. Maybe throw a few more in there. Maybe there's going to be a zillion, right? And they're all totally different from each other. If we treat it as a uniform probability distribution, we would have to say whatever number of basic laws or entities we end up with has to be totally random. So it's a uniform probability distribution because the chances of getting any one number are the same as the chances of getting any other. So this is like when you're throwing dice, right? The probability, if you have a 6-sided die and it's fair, your probability of getting a 3 is exactly the same as your probability of getting a 6 or a 1. They're all the same. So it's uniform. So then the chance of ending up with X basic laws would be the same as ending up with Y basic laws for any numbers X and Y. The problem is there's no biggest number, right? What's the biggest number? Well, there isn't a biggest number. For any number you pick, you can pick one slightly bigger. So because there would be no principled reason for saying, here's the upper bound, we're going to run into a problem because there isn't any highest number of possible values. And so with the uniform option, we're trying to say, it seems like what ought to be true is that there's a smaller chance of getting, say, 10 or fewer entities than of, say, getting 1,000 or fewer. But that's not going to work on the uniform probability distribution if we try to stretch it out over an infinite range. Because what you have to do is you take the chances of getting X or fewer, and you have to divide that into the total number of possible values. But that's X over infinity. I mean, that doesn't give you a number. Your math teacher will slap you with a ruler across your knuckles, right? You can't do that. So there's an intuition here, but I think it's wrong because when we stipulate that the range is limitless, for any X and Y that we pick, when we divide them into infinity, we get the same result, namely something that's essentially 0. Again, that's sort of cheating. But that's why there isn't any uniform distribution for infinite ranges. So again, the intuition is something kind of like this, if you want to think of it this way. Well, it just seems like 1,000,000 times 0 gives you something bigger than 4 times 0. But it doesn't. It gives you 0, right? Either way. And so it seems like maybe, well, if I'm going to end up with 10 or fewer out of this infinite range, that's less probable than ending up with a gazillion or fewer out of the infinite range. But it's not actually. Well, maybe that was a wrong-headed thing to do. Maybe we shouldn't have tried to have an infinite range for the uniform probability distribution, and that's a mistake. So maybe it's non-uniform. Maybe the distribution doesn't follow that flat kind of curve. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it was a mistake to assume that for any X and any Y, the probability of X was the same as the probability of Y. It does seem plausible, doesn't it, after all, that some values might have a higher likelihood. It does seem plausible to say, I don't know, 20 basic entities is more likely than 8,462,000. But why do we think that? Ahead of time, we don't have any reason for saying that. I mean, the uniform probability distribution function is going to be the wrong choice. But what PDF is the right choice? So there are non-uniform PDFs, lots of them, and they share some features. The shapes of these PDFs, whether they're continuous or whether they're discrete, they're a function of fundamental parameters. So some of them, you've seen distributions like this, the normal distribution, right? The bell-shaped curve. Or some of them will start off, approaching infinity as you get close to 0 in the x-axis, and then they dip down, and then they tail off towards 0 as you go out towards infinity with x. Or maybe they have a series of humps, right? So they can take all kinds of shapes, and you wouldn't know ahead of time, without having independent trials to consult, which of those shapes it's going to be. So usually what we do is we retrofit a curve or a function on top of the data points. But what are the data points here? We would need repeated experiments on universes, but we don't have that. So we're not actually in a position to say what the curve is going to look like. So how would we select the parameters that determine the shape of the curve so we can see which values are more likely? There isn't any non-question begging way of doing that. There isn't any a priori principle for saying, well, here are the parameters, and here's what the curve is going to look like, and here's where it's going to peak, and this is how many peaks it's going to have. There's no way for us to do that. We just don't have access to that sort of data. So here's what I'm saying so far. On either of the two major views of laws of nature, it seems to me that laws are actually going to be inevitable. They're going to be found in nature no matter what. And it doesn't really have anything to do with God's existence. Nor does God's existence make it more likely that there would be a small number of simple laws. I appreciate the intuition, but I think if we talk about it in terms of probabilities, in a number in the range from 0 to 1, and where all the probabilities sum to 1, I think that's going to be a road that's a dead end. So, when we're talking about probabilities and the likelihood, I think we would need another route to say anything about that. But look, we also know this, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, and night after night they reveal knowledge. How do they do this? Paul says in Romans, what may be known about God is plain to them because God's made it plain to them. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. And as Augustine says, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find rest in you. What I think the right thing to do is, when we're thinking about this sort of argument, is to talk about a different kind of probability. So in philosophy, we talk about objective probabilities, and that's the stuff I've been talking about before, where it's mathematical, there are axioms that govern it, you got to range from 0 to 1, they all need to add to 1, and other sorts of rules about that. But we also talk about subjective probability. So if somebody calls me on the phone and says, hey, Brad, you know what? They just arrested your wife for a bank robbery. I would say, that's improbable, right? But I don't mean in that, well, let's see, how many days has she been alive, and what's the ratio of bank robbing days to non-bank robbing days? Oh, it's very low. So that's what I mean when I'm saying it's improbable. I calculated at 0.05% or less, right? That would be a weird way. So we make other kinds of judgments about probability in this subjective way. So objective probability is built on the notion that an event's probability is the ratio of times it would occur out of a series of trials and so forth. That's kind of the basic motif driving that kind of probability. Subjective probability is a report about how likely something seems to us. It's subjective. It's epistemic. It's, one way to think about it is, it's what we would be willing to wager that something is true. I'll wager any money at all that my wife didn't rob a bank. Any money. I don't have a limit. Or as a measure of our surprise that something is true. On a scale of 1 to 10, how surprised would you be if this were to happen? Okay, well, that's how you judge its probability then. So the arguments from laws to God may not work if we refer to objective probability, but they may work regarding subjective probability. So by improbable then, what we really mean is implausible. It's an affront to our best judgment. And I think here there is a probabilistic argument for laws to God. And it has to do with these things, that God day by day is pouring forth speech and has revealed himself in our heart, and he's made us to know himself. And he's spoken to us not only through the prophets and through his Son, but even through the creation itself. So there's been work recently on the naturalness of religious belief. And some of this is from the perspective of a skeptic. I mentioned David Hume earlier, kind of the skeptic of all skeptics. He talks about something called a religious propensity. He says, I don't know why, but people just have a tendency to believe in God. Thomas Reid, a Scottish common sense philosopher, says the same thing. We can talk about Alvin Plantinga, a contemporary analytic Christian philosopher, and Reformed epistemology, which is a movement that says knowledge of God is the result of properly functioning faculties that God has put there. Even other skeptics in our day, Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins, they find this very irksome, right? And they think that if they could only find a way to beat this instinct out of us, we would all be better off. But Dennett and Richard Dawkins talk about the propensity we have to form beliefs about God. A hyperactive agency detection mechanism is one of Dennett's clunky phrases for it, but it's charming in its own way, I suppose. Cognitive science of religion. again, from believers or from skeptics. We've got some believers, Justin Barrett and Kelly Clark, talking about this way that we are wired to form beliefs about God. So a common theme to all of these over the last several centuries is that there is actually something very natural about religious belief. So when we are functioning properly, my conclusion here, when we're functioning properly, I affirm as a Christian that we are made to perceive God in creation. It's not through this complicated probabilistic reasoning, though. It's something much more personal, and it's something much more difficult to pin down, right? And this is why Pascal says, the heart has reasons that reason knows nothing of. Because we don't just believe in God with our head. Belief in God is a whole person response to what we perceive and who we are as creatures made in his image. So when we're functioning properly, we have these perceptions, and belief in God is akin to a perception in that way. So the elegance and the simplicity and the beauty of the world and the laws that govern it, these are examples of the belief triggers that result properly in God beliefs by divine design. These are things that God has implanted in us. So there is actually, I think, a connection between the laws of nature and nature's God, as natural theologians are putting out, even a probabilistic one. But the probability is not done best through these objective arguments and assigning numbers and using Bayes' theorem and doing all these numerical analyses of likelihoods. I think it's rather a different methodology that ties our observations of the world to the God who made it through what's already in us and what we're inclined to believe and accept when we are open to his revelation. So that's it. That's it for me. I will now move on to chim chimney, chim chimney, chim chim chiroo. If I could have the brooms brought out from the closet. No.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sickler. All right, as we enter this last Q&A, does anyone have a question for Brad?
You offered a couple different ways to think about the laws of nature. How do you think about these laws?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think for me the best way to think about laws is as descriptions of God's acting according to his commitments and plans. And so a law of nature will display regularity, right? But there are a lot of complications here because not all laws are totally regular. Like some laws are probabilistic or stochastic. Some laws, things like smoking causes cancer. Well, some people get cancer without lung cancer without smoking. Some people smoke without getting lung cancer, yet we still think there's a sort of law-like connection there. But I think if we think of laws as regularities in how God acts, right? So seeing the world as being brought into being by God according to his plans and his commitments, I think that's what a law of nature captures, is those internal commitments that God has for how the world will manifest regularities. Any other questions? This is like being in the classroom.
All right, once again, you will have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Sickler in the reception to come. So please join me in one last round of applause. Now I'll invite my colleague Jim Johnson to give you some final instructions in regard to the reception.
Can you join me one more time, though, and thank our presenters? Are they not fantastic? That was great. Wow. I want to thank each of them, and I want to let you all know that is just a small taste of what we see God doing inside the classrooms here at Northwestern, excuse me, each and every day. And yet it's not just in the classroom, it's in the hallway. I see it when Dr. Sickler is sitting across from a student in the lunchroom. I see it when I see yet another student walking into Dr. Mork's office, not to talk about a paper or a test, but to talk about life. I see it when I see Dr. Heyer, who we affectionately call often the Pied Piper, as we see groups of students traveling across campus with him. And yet it's not just these three, it's taking place with countless faculty across this campus. It's not just the faculty, it's hundreds of staff that drive onto this campus every day and say, how do we build into the next generation that follows us? It's not just the classroom, but in chapel, the hallways, the dorms, the locker rooms, the stage, the choral and band rooms, and so many other spots across this campus. And it's not just on this campus, but God is moving in and through our students as they pursue their callings beyond this campus. And lastly, it's not just on or slightly off of this campus, but it's literally felt through the gospel reach throughout the Midwest, through our airwaves, as well as our alumni as they travel their calling throughout the globe. Northwestern, by God's grace in his hand, is stretching the minds and moving in the hearts. And you just got a little glimpse of that tonight. But the Northwesterns of this world, and we know that they are becoming fewer every day, but the Northwesterns of this world, they don't exist without faithful support of individuals and families like yourself. So again, we say thank you for standing beside us. For those of you that maybe have never considered that, we ask you to join us. You can do that in one of two ways. With your resources, yes, and again, we thank those that have done that so faithfully for so long. Maybe you haven't done that before and would like to discuss that further. But we genuinely come to you with an open heart and say, you can support us through your prayers. One group I did not recognize in the welcome that I will do right now, I'm going to ask if you're a current student of Northwestern, would you just simply stand where you're at? I know there's several of you across the room. But these students, as well as our listeners, is exactly why we do what we do. And it's why you, those of you that are faithful supporters, and those of you that may join us, I ask of you, I beg of you to pray over them day in and day out. Boy, when you think and you see what's going on in the world and how it seems to be decaying and falling apart, and yet you come to an event like this and you see how God is using our amazing faculty and the staff to build into this next generation, and I can attest, we've got some of the most amazing students, and it gives me a great hope as we say this is the next generation that follows us, that takes forth the gospel into all walks of life and into all vocations and does a greater kingdom work, and that we can say a huge amen. Amen? Awesome. Thank you, students. I'm going to give you some brief logistics for what the rest of the night looks like, but I'm going to ask our presenters and their families, as well as the Curitans, they're going to slip out the side aisle there. They're going to make their way out before any of the rest of you move. We want to make sure they get positioned over in our great hall and that you can meet them. So speakers, as well as the Curitans, as well as families that have come with them, you can sure leave at this point and just kind of make your way out. And as you're making your way out, I will give you, the rest of you, some brief instructions. Some of you did not know this, but there is a bonus to this night. As your minds have just burned a ton of calories, we are going to replenish that with dessert. In the next room, over from this room, we have the Great Hall, and in the Great Hall, you will find an amazing dessert table, as well as coffee, as well as sodas, those kind of things. And we just want you to come and enjoy the time of fellowship and getting to know one another and just a very casual environment, as well as each of our presenters will be stationed throughout the room. There are 3 high top tables, 2 in the corners as immediately as you walk into the large room, and 1 in the back corner. And you will find one of those presenters there. They would love to dialogue with you further about what they talked about tonight or anything else that maybe you think that would be a great question or something of that you'd like to bring to them. They're available for that tonight. And so enjoy that time and that opportunity. I'm going to close our time in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Dear God, we come before you. We thank you so much for the opportunity that you provided for us tonight to truly stretch our minds as well as to tug on our hearts. Lord, I just praise you for the good work that you're doing here at Northwestern. I thank you for these amazing people that are in attendance tonight. I pray that they would have just a great time of fellowship, as well as taking in some of the desserts and even having further dialogue with our presenters, as well as discussion with others around them. Lord, we praise you and give you the glory for all that has happened here tonight. In your precious name, amen. Thank you so much for coming. You're dismissed.